Hello. I understand this is just before the coffee break, so I'll try and keep it as interesting as possible and hopefully as short as possible. Um, so today I'm here to present about one of our work, which is titled Facing Employees and Customers. What do eye gaze and facial expressions tell us about soft skills? Um, Before I go into that, a little bit about me. I'm currently a postdoc at the Idiap Research Institute in Martigny. I work with Professor Daniel Getica Perez in the social computing group, where essentially what we do is we are looking at, it's a multidisciplinary area of research. So we are looking to combine theories from signal processing, ubiquitous computing, social sciences like Marianne, and to come up with, to sense, to analyze, and to interpret, the keyword, interpret human behavior in both workplace contexts, in a group context, and to be able and to create systems that can help support these interactions and communications. So that's globally what we do in the social computing group. So what do I do in the group? Bear with me, at the cost of sounding hubristic, I teach machines to predict automatically how individuals perceive one another and to model the cognitive processes that codify the formation of first impressions. Yeah, sounds a little bragging. You will see why I sort of claim this in some time. I use the word social sensing. What is social sensing? Social sensing is basically a multidisciplinary area of research where which is at the junction of signal processing, psychology, ubiquitous computing, and machine learning. It's an important area of research because when we interact with other humans, it consists of both verbal and nonverbal behavior. This ability to perceive and express nonverbal behavior through both visual stimuli and auditory modes is actually called as social sensing, which is currently lacking when we interact with our devices like a laptop or a computer. So in this talk, there are varied forms of nonverbal behavior, but in this talk, I'm going to focus on our research which looked at eye gaze and facial expressions. This is a very important cues which form the foundation of interpersonal communication. So if you want to sort of interact with someone new, what's the very first thing you do? You look at them and you smile, right? That's the very first thing that you do. Literature in psychology has shown that these behavioral cues are correlated to the formation of first impressions, which I'm sure you guys know is defined as the mental image one forms about someone after the first meeting. So why is first impressions important? Because again, psychology literature has shown that first impressions form a very important role in many social interactions, be it in the personal front, on a date, or in workplace environments like you're negotiating your salary, you want to get hired, and anything, any of these interactions, in any of these situations, first impressions have shown to play a very important role. These are even more critical in client-centric interactions like hospitality, where the first impressions may pretty much be the last. Let's take our own example. When you walk into a hotel to check in, you form impressions about not just the person you're interacting with, but the entire organization whom that person represents, right? So first impressions are crucial. And which is then connected to good interpersonal communication, which leaves us very positively predisposed towards not just that person, but also the organization. Hospitality literature has also shown that eye gaze and facial expressions play a crucial role. Specifically, it's been shown that eye gaze is linked to increased trust, credibility, likability, and customer satisfaction. Similarly, facial expressions too have been linked to interpersonal warmth and friendliness, especially through smiling. Traditionally, these domains have relied on people manually coding each of these behavioral cues, which is, well, time-consuming and very labor-intensive. With the advances in mobile and ubiquitous sensors, capturing eye gaze and facial expressions have become easier. And just think of Apple emojis. I mean, we all have Apple iPhones in our pockets. So that tells you how easy it's become to sort of capture people's facial expressions. Other people have also looked at using facial expressions in computing literature, especially in the context of workplaces. You see perceived hireability, you see personality, you see leadership. But what I'm doing is slightly different in the sense that most of these people have looked at a single situation. So how is it that happens in job interviews only? Here I'll be looking at multiple settings. To put my research in context, the broader goal of this project was to develop a framework to help young hospitality students to train themselves with an aim to improve their nonverbal behavior as a part of their professional development and training efforts. So the idea here is not to say you're hired or you're fired, but more to say your behavior, you can improve these things to make a better impression. So this is a very important context for us to remember. Towards this, we collaborated with the hospitality school to collect our data. And as the aim is to provide feedback, the focus is on interpretability of features rather than performance accuracies. So what exactly am I going to talk about here? In this work, we investigate the connections between eye gaze, facial expressions in both perceived hireability. Marianne mentioned what is meant by perceived hireability is just what the person who's looking at the interaction thinks about the person during the job interviews, and perceived job performance in case of the hotel reception desk. I'll talk a little more about that. If you want to do anything in computer science, you need data sets, right? And because for this particular work, there existed no previous data set, we had to collect that. With the help of the hospitality school, we collected a data set consisting of 169 videos in 2 settings. That's about 338 videos. In the job interviews, which was role-played, had structured interviews consisting of 7 questions. There was a role-played reception desk scenario where the client was initially friendly and then turns unhappy and angry once he receives the bill. No surprises there. So we took these videos, and the first thing we did was we tried to obtain crowdsource labels of soft skill impressions. So this is the basis on which we would be training our model. For the job interviews, we annotated various skills like professional skills, social skills, communication skills. Apart from that, we looked at perceived hireability. These were rated by 5 master's students at the University of Lausanne. They rated these participants on a scale of 1 to 7, where 7 is like absolutely hireable, 1 is absolutely not hireable. That's not the keywords used, but that's what I remember. The inter-rater agreement, which is important, ranged from 0.52 for professional skills and 0.73 for perceived hireability. Similarly, for the reception desk situation, you may observe that the skills are pretty much similar. This is on design to help us compare across the 2 situations. And then there was perceived performance. So all of these was rated by 3 master students, again on a scale of 1 to 7. And in this case, the agreement between the raters varied from 0.60 to 0.77. So with these crowdsource labels done, we then look to extract various features of interest, ranging from facial expressions and gaze, which is pretty much the title of the talk. We were also looking at other features, other visual features like head nods, body expressivity, other auditory features like speaking time, speaking duration, speaking energy, and a whole bunch of others. So we extracted the facial expressions using the Microsoft Azure Cloud API because it's cheap and easy. But in order to do so, the first thing we did is we had to remove the frames in which the participants were speaking. This is sort of important because when you remove your facial, when you're speaking, you use your facial muscles. This will then affect the emotions that's being perceived. So once we removed the frames where the participants were speaking, rest of the frames were inputs to the Microsoft Azure API, which then returned confidence values between 0 and 1 for each of these 8 expressions, facial expressions. For the gaze, we used a method proposed in literature, and we extracted 3 important features. One is gazing while speaking. Essentially, you're looking at the other person when you're talking. Gazing while listening. Are you looking at the person when you're listening? And what is known as the visual dominance ratio, VDR. VDR is interesting. It's calculated by dividing the percentage of time a person looks at the other person while speaking with the amount of time the person looks at the other person while listening. Ideally, we would want this to be as high as possible, because a high VDR shows, literature in psychology has shown that a high VDR essentially indicates a high degree of dominance, while a low VDR value indicates an attitude of subservience. Okay, so now we have the features. Now we have the annotations from the crowdsource, from the raters. The first thing we did was to look at the correlations between these two. Is there any connection? There is. We see that in the interview setting, there is low to moderate correlation between eye gaze, facial expressions, and all of these perceived skills. Specifically, we see that participants who had greater visual dominance ratio and presented us a happy expression, which is sort of cue for smiling, were perceived to be more hireable than the participants who did not. These results are backed up by those in literature, and which report positive correlations between these features and hireability. At the desk scenario as well, we see that there was moderate correlation between eye gaze and facial expressions and other soft skills. Particularly, participants who held clients' gaze for longer while speaking displayed greater VDR and nonverbal immediacy, essentially, which means that they sort of mirrored the participants' the client's unhappiness and anger, were perceived to be better performing than participants who did not. These two have been backed in literature. So as surprising as it sounds, it's been shown that even in situations where the customer is dissatisfied, a greater eye contact helps enhance perceptions of credibility. There have also been other literature which looked at dissatisfied clients, and it has shown that their assessment of the employee's emotional state helps improve customers' level of satisfaction. These are mostly literature in hospitality that I'm quoting. So with the initial correlation analysis done, we then try to develop, we developed a computational framework to infer these impressions from nonverbal cues. So we defined the inference as a regression problem, and we evaluated the random forest, and the hyperparameters were basically trained using tenfold cross-validation, pretty much standard machine learning techniques. And our evaluation metric was the coefficient of determination, R squared. Here we see the results. So I know it's a lot of colors, but I'm going to show you only hireability and performance. Putting everything else just becomes a mess. To start with gaze, we see that gaze in both these situations has sort of low performance. Facial expressions was like even lower. And fusing the two sort of performed slightly better, but not really by much. So essentially what it's showing is that using eye gaze and facial expressions and their combinations is very good at predicting the average score, but does not really explain the variance that we have in the data. The other auditory features that we have perform relatively well, 0.29 and 0.3. This is pretty much the important sort of takeaway from this talk. Fusing facial expressions and eye gaze improves over using just other features that of behavior during these two situations. So just to wrap up, in this work, we found moderate correlations between eye gaze, facial expressions, and perceived soft skills in both situations. Though there was low performance using eye gaze and even lower performance using facial expressions. Fusing these expressions with other features, with the other behavioral cues, though, provided the best inference performance. So now, currently, I'm working on investigating how, with all of these behavioral cues, you can provide feedback to individuals to help improve their nonverbal behavior. Just before I end, I would like to thank Laura, Denise, and their research assistants in helping me collect the data, and Professor Marian for giving me the opportunity to speak. Last but not the least, the Swiss National Science Foundation for funding the project. Thank you.